the new God of faith, the new gods of faith, the new God of faith, the new goddess of faith, the new goddesses of faith, the new goddess of faith, the old God of faith, the old gods of faith, the old God of faith, the old goddess of faith, the old goddesses of faith, the old goddess of faith, the greater God of faith, the greater gods of faith, the greater God of faith, the greater goddess of faith, the greater goddesses of faith, the greater goddess of faith, the lesser God of faith, the lesser gods of faith, the lesser God of faith, the lesser goddess of faith, the lesser goddesses of faith, the lesser goddess of faith, the higher God of faith, the higher gods of faith, the higher God of faith, the higher goddess of faith, the higher goddesses of faith, the higher goddess of faith, the lower God of faith, the lower gods of faith, the lower God of faith, the lower goddess of faith, the lower goddesses of faith, the lower goddess of faith, the greater spirit of faith, the greater spirits of faith, the greater spirit of faith, the lesser spirit of faith, the lesser spirits of faith, the lesser spirit of faith, the higher spirit of faith, the higher spirits of faith, the higher spirit of faith, the lower spirit of faith, the lower spirits of faith, the lower spirit of faith, the major God of faith, the major gods of faith, the major God of faith, the major goddess of faith, the major goddesses of faith, the major goddess of faith, the minor God of faith, the minor gods of faith, the minor God of faith, the minor goddess of faith, the minor goddesses of faith, the minor goddess of faith, the superior God of faith, the superior gods of faith, the superior God of faith, the superior goddess of faith, the superior goddesses of faith, the superior goddess of faith, the inferior God of faith, the inferior gods of faith, the inferior God of faith, the inferior goddess of faith, the inferior goddesses of faith, the inferior goddess of faith, the ancestor God of faith, the ancestor gods of faith, the ancestor God of faith, the ancestor goddess of faith, the ancestor goddesses of faith, the ancestor goddess of faith, the ascendant God of faith, the ascendant gods of faith, the ascendant God of faith, the ascendant goddess of faith, the ascendant goddesses of faith, the ascendant goddess of faith, the descendant God of faith, the descendant gods of faith, the descendant God of faith, the descendant goddess of faith, the descendant goddesses of faith, the descendant goddess of faith, the transcendent God of faith, the transcendent gods of faith, the transcendent God of faith, the transcendent goddess of faith, the transcendent goddesses of faith, the transcendent goddess of faith, the past God of faith, the past gods of faith, the past God of faith, the past goddess of faith, the past goddesses of faith, the past goddess of faith, the present God of faith, the present gods of faith, the present God of faith, the present goddess of faith, the present goddesses of faith, the present goddess of faith, the future God of faith, the future gods of faith, the future God of faith, the future goddess of faith, the future goddesses of faith, the future goddess of faith, the authentic God of faith, the authentic gods of faith, the authentic God of faith, the authentic goddess of faith, the authentic goddesses of faith, the authentic goddess of faith, the synthetic God of faith, the synthetic gods of faith, the synthetic God of faith, the synthetic goddess of faith, the synthetic goddesses of faith, the synthetic goddess of faith, the progressive God of faith, the progressive gods of faith, the progressive God of faith, the progressive goddess of faith, the progressive goddesses of faith, the progressive goddess of faith, the regressive God of faith, the regressive gods of faith, the regressive God of faith, the regressive goddess of faith, the regressive goddesses of faith, the regressive goddess of faith, the ordinary God of faith, the ordinary gods of faith, the ordinary God of faith, the ordinary goddess of faith, the ordinary goddesses of faith, the ordinary goddess of faith, the extraordinary God of faith, the extraordinary gods of faith, the extraordinary God of faith, the extraordinary goddess of faith, the extraordinary goddesses of faith, the extraordinary goddess of faith, the static God of faith, the static gods of faith, the static God of faith, the static goddess of faith, the static goddesses of faith, the static goddess of faith, the dynamic God of faith, the dynamic gods of faith, the dynamic God of faith, the dynamic goddess of faith, the dynamic goddesses of faith, the dynamic goddess of faith, the land god of faith, the land gods of faith, the land god of faith, the land goddess of faith, the land goddesses of faith, the land goddess of faith, the sea god of faith, the sea gods of faith, the sea god of faith, the sea goddess of faith, the sea goddesses of faith, the sea goddess of faith, the sky god of faith, the sky gods of faith, the sky god of faith, the sky goddess of faith, the sky goddesses of faith, the sky goddess of faith, the god of faith, the gods of faith, the god of faith, the goddess of faith, the goddesses of faith, the goddess of faith, the half god of faith, the half gods of faith, the half god of faith, the half goddess of faith, the half goddesses of faith, the half goddess of faith, the vessel of faith, the vessels of faith, the vessel of faith, the name of faith, the names of faith, the name of faith, the person of faith, the persons of faith, the person of faith, the persona of faith, the personas of faith, the persona of faith, the personage of faith, the personages of faith, the personage of faith, the personality of faith, the personalities of faith, the personality of faith, the personification of faith, the personifications of faith, the personification of faith, the image of faith, the images of faith, the image of faith, the imagination of faith, the imaginations of faith, the imagination of faith, the belief of faith, the beliefs of faith, the belief of faith, the thought of faith, the thoughts of faith, the thought of faith, the word of faith, the words of faith, the word of faith, the action of faith, the actions of faith, the action of faith, the reaction of faith, the reactions of faith, the reaction of faith, the feeling of faith, the feelings of faith, the feeling of faith, the situation of faith, the situations of faith, the situation of faith, the circumstance of faith, the circumstances of faith, the circumstance of faith, the environment of faith, the environments of faith, the environment of faith, the relationship of faith, the relationships of faith, the relationship of faith, the number of faith, the numbers of faith, the number of faith, the formula of faith, the formulas of faith, the formula of faith, the equation of faith, the equations of faith, the equation of faith, the theory of faith, the theories of faith, the theory of faith, the symbol of faith, the symbols of faith, the symbol of faith, the color of faith, the colors of faith, the color of faith, the thing of faith, the things of faith, the thing of faith, the way of faith, the ways of faith, the way of faith, the place of faith, the places of faith, the place of faith, the time of faith, the times of faith, the time of faith, the event of faith, the events of faith, the event of faith, the result of faith, the results of faith, the result of faith, the crown of faith, the crowns of faith, the crown of faith, the throne of faith, the thrones of faith, the throne of faith, the faith king, the faith kings, the faith kingdom, the faith kingdoms, the faith king's subject, the faith king's subjects, the faith king's dominion, the faith king's dominions, the kingdom of faith, the kingdoms of faith, the kingdom of faith, the faith queen, the faith queens, the faith queendom, the faith queendoms, the faith queen's subject, the faith queen's subjects, the faith queen's dominion, the faith queen's dominions, the queendom of faith, the queendoms of faith, the queendom of faith, the faith prince, the faith princes, the faith princedom, the faith princedoms, the faith prince's subject, the faith prince's subjects, the faith prince's dominion, the faith prince's dominions, the princedom of faith, the princedoms of faith, the princedom of faith, the faith princess, the faith princesses, the faith princessdom, the faith princessdoms, the faith princess's subject, the faith princess's subjects, the faith princess's dominion, the faith princess's dominions, the princessdom of faith, the princessdoms of faith, the princessdom of faith, the lord of faith, the lords of faith, the lord of faith, the lordess of faith, The Lordess is of faith. The Lordess of faith. The priest of faith. The priests of faith. The priest of faith. The priestess of faith. The priestesses of faith. The priestess of faith. The ritual of faith. The rituals of faith. The ritual of faith. The shrine of faith. The shrines of faith. The shrine of faith. The temple of faith. The temples of faith. The temple of faith. The leader of faith. The leaders of faith. The leader of faith. The follower of faith. The followers of faith. The follower of faith. The natural substance of faith. The natural substances of faith. The natural substance of faith. The supernatural substance of faith. The supernatural substances of faith. The supernatural substance of faith. The temporal substance of faith. The temporal substances of faith. The temporal substance of faith. The spiritual substance of faith. The spiritual substances of faith. The spiritual substance of faith. The natural form of faith. The natural forms of faith. The natural form of faith. The supernatural form of faith. The supernatural forms of faith. The supernatural form of faith. The temporal form of faith. The temporal forms of faith. The temporal form of faith. The spiritual form of faith. The spiritual forms of faith. The spiritual form of faith. The age of faith. The ages of faith. The age of faith. The era of faith. The eras of faith. The era of faith. The awakener of faith. The awakeners of faith. The awakener of faith. The awakening of faith. The awakenings of faith. The awakening of faith. The realm of faith. The realms of faith. The realm of faith. The dimension of faith. The dimensions of faith. The dimension of faith. The zone of faith. The zones of faith. The zone of faith. The frequency of faith. The frequencies of faith. The frequency of faith. The century of faith. The centuries of faith. The century of faith. The millennium of faith. The millenniums of faith. The millennium of faith. The purpose of faith. The purposes of faith. The purpose of faith. The meaning of faith. The meanings of faith. The meaning of faith. The culture of faith. The cultures of faith. The culture of faith. The demonstrator of faith. The demonstrators of faith. The demonstrator of faith. The demonstration of faith. The demonstrations of faith. The demonstration of faith. The manifester of faith. The manifestors of faith. The manifester of faith. The manifestation of faith. The manifestations of faith. The manifestation of faith. The presence of faith. The presences of faith. The presence of faith. The glow of faith. The glows of faith. The glow of faith. The goal of faith. The goals of faith. The goal of faith. The plan of faith. The plans of faith. The plan of faith. The book of faith. The books of faith. The book of faith. The philosopher of faith. The philosophers of faith. The philosopher of faith. The philosophy of faith. The philosophies of faith. The philosophy of faith. The releaser of faith. The releasers of faith. The releaser of faith. The release of faith. The releases of faith. The release of faith. The variable of faith. The variables of faith. The variable of faith. The cause of faith. The causes of faith. The cause of faith. The effect of faith. The effects of faith. The effect of faith. The journey of faith. The journeys of faith. The journey of faith. The emergence of faith. The emergences of faith. The emergence of faith. The source of faith. The sources of faith. The source of faith. The originator of faith. The originators of faith. The originator of faith. The origin of faith. The origins of faith. The origin of faith. The forefather of faith. The forefathers of faith. The forefather of faith. The foremother of faith. The foremothers of faith. The foremother of faith. The ancestor of faith. The ancestors of faith. The ancestor of faith. The descendant of faith. The descendants of faith. The descendant of faith. The lineage of faith. The lineages of faith. The lineage of faith. The heritage of faith. The heritages of faith. The heritage of faith. The heir of faith. The heirs of faith. The heir of faith. The co-heir of faith. The co-heirs of faith. The co-heir of faith. The joint heir of faith. The joint heirs of faith. The joint heir of faith. The dynasty of faith. The dynasties of faith. The dynasty of faith. The force of faith. The forces of faith. The force of faith. The law of faith. The laws of faith. The law of faith. the pact of faith, the pacts of faith, the pact of faith, the game of faith, the games of faith, the game of faith, the mask of faith, the masks of faith, the mask of faith, the armor of faith, the armors of faith, the armor of faith, the sword of faith, the swords of faith, the sword of faith, the shield of faith, the shields of faith, the shield of faith, the force shield of faith, the force shields of faith, the force shield of faith, the armored force shield of faith, the armored force shields of faith, the armored force shield of faith, the champion of faith, the champions of faith, the champion of faith, the guardian of faith, the guardians of faith, the guardian of faith, the defender of faith, the defenders of faith, the defender of faith, the protector of faith, the protectors of faith, the protector of faith, the chant of faith, the chants of faith, the chant of faith, the shape of faith, the shapes of faith, the shape of faith, the cube of faith, the cubes of faith, the cube of faith, the cuboid of faith, the cuboids of faith, the cuboid of faith, the sphere of faith, the spheres of faith, the sphere of faith, the spheroid of faith, the spheroids of faith, the spheroid of faith, the prism of faith, the prisms of faith, the prism of faith, the pyramid of faith, the pyramids of faith, the pyramid of faith, the cylinder of faith, the cylinders of faith, the cylinder of faith, the cone of faith, the cones of faith, the cone of faith, the triangle of faith, the triangles of faith, the triangle of faith, the circle of faith, the circles of faith, the circle of faith, the semicircle of faith, the semicircles of faith, the semicircle of faith, the square of faith, the squares of faith, the square of faith, the rectangle of faith, the rectangles of faith, the rectangle of faith, the parallelogram of faith, the parallelograms of faith, the parallelogram of faith, the rhombus of faith, the rhombuses of faith, the rhombus of faith, the trapezoid of faith, the trapezoids of faith, the trapezoid of faith, the polygon of faith, the polygons of faith, the polygon of faith, the pentagon of faith, the pentagons of faith, the pentagon of faith, the hexagon of faith, the hexagons of faith, the hexagon of faith, the septagon of faith, the septagons of faith, the septagon of faith, the octagon of faith, the octagons of faith, the octagon of faith, the nonagon of faith, the nonagons of faith, the nonagon of faith, the decagon of faith, the decagons of faith, the decagon of faith, the evolution of faith, the evolutions of faith, the evolution of faith, the revolution of faith, the revolutions of faith, the revolution of faith, the elemental art of faith, the elemental arts of faith, the elemental art of faith, the elemental science of faith, the elemental sciences of faith, the elemental science of faith, the elemental principle of faith, the elemental principles of faith, the elemental principle of faith, the elemental technology of faith, the elemental technologies of faith, the elemental technology of faith, the low elemental art of faith, the low elemental arts of faith, the low elemental art of faith, the low elemental science of faith, the low elemental sciences of faith, the low elemental science of faith, the low elemental principle of faith, the low elemental principles of faith, the low elemental principle of faith, the low elemental technology of faith, the low elemental technologies of faith, the low elemental technology of faith, the high elemental art of faith, the high elemental arts of faith, the high elemental art of faith, the high elemental science of faith, the high elemental sciences of faith, the high elemental science of faith, the high elemental principle of faith, the high elemental principles of faith, the high elemental principle of faith, the high elemental technology of faith, the high elemental technologies of faith, the high elemental technology of faith, the agent of faith, the agents of faith, the agent of faith, the agency of faith, the agencies of faith, the agency of faith, the amplifier of faith, the amplifiers of faith, the amplifier of faith, the amplification of faith, the amplifications of faith, the amplification of faith, the enhancer of faith, the enhancers of faith, the enhancer of faith, the enhancement of faith, the enhancements of faith, the enhancement of faith, the magnifier of faith, the magnifiers of faith, the magnifier of faith, the magnification of faith, the magnifications of faith, the magnification of faith, the influencer of faith, the influencers of faith, the influencer of faith, the influence of faith, the influences of faith, the influence of faith, the emanator of faith, the emanators of faith, the emanator of faith, the emanation of faith, the emanations of faith, the emanation of faith, the converger of faith, the convergers of faith, the converger of faith, the convergence of faith, the convergences of faith, the convergence of faith, the aura of faith, the auras of faith, the aura of faith, the impression of faith, the impressions of faith, the impression of faith, the intelligence of faith, the intelligences of faith, the intelligence of faith, the sophistication of faith, the sophistications of faith, the sophistication of faith, the genius of faith, the geniuses of faith, the genius of faith, the polymath of faith, the polymaths of faith, the polymath of faith, the psychic of faith, the psychics of faith, the psychic of faith, the knowledge of faith, the knowledges of faith, the knowledge of faith, the understanding of faith, the understandings of faith, the understanding of faith, the wisdom of faith, the wisdoms of faith, the wisdom of faith, the secret of faith, the secrets of faith, the secret of faith, the mystery of faith, the mysteries of faith, the mystery of faith, the revelation of faith, the revelations of faith, the revelation of faith, the tactic of faith, the tactics of faith, the tactic of faith, the strategy of faith, the strategies of faith, the strategy of faith, the strength of faith, the strengths of faith, the strength of faith, the might of faith, the mights of faith, the might of faith, the power of faith, the powers of faith, the power of faith, the authority of faith, the authorities of faith, the authority of faith, the dominion of faith, the dominions of faith, the dominion of faith, the rhythm of faith, the rhythms of faith, the rhythm of faith, the melody of faith, the melodies of faith, the melody of faith, the music of faith, the musics of faith, the music of faith, the lyric of faith, the lyrics of faith, the lyric of faith, the song of faith, the songs of faith, the song of faith, the dance of faith, the dances of faith, the dance of faith, the spirit of faith, the spirits of faith, the spirit of faith, the soul of faith, the souls of faith, the soul of faith, the body of faith, the bodies of faith, the body of faith, the mark of faith, the marks of faith, the mark of faith, the promise of faith, the promises of faith, the promise of faith, the visionary of faith, the visionaries of faith, the visionary of faith, the vision of faith, the visions of faith, the vision of faith, the picture of faith, the pictures of faith, the picture of faith, the sound of faith, the sounds of faith, the sound of faith, the dung of faith, the dungs of faith, the dung of faith, the language of faith, the languages of faith, the language of faith, the communication of faith, the communications of faith, the communication of faith, the people of faith, the peoples of faith, the people of faith, the society of faith, the societies of faith, the society of faith, the fortress of faith, the fortresses of faith, the fortress of faith, the government of faith, the governments of faith, the government of faith, the city of faith, the cities of faith, the city of faith, the nation of faith, the nations of faith, the nation of faith, the civilization of faith, the civilizations of faith, the civilization of faith, the world of faith, the worlds of faith, the world of faith,